much, and thanks for coming to near the graveyard shift on the afternoon. Final day. I hope we can make it a bit interesting. My name's Craven. I'm the chairman of Specialisterne in Australia and a member of the global board of the Specialisterne Foundation, which comes out of Denmark. More of that a little bit later on. And with me here is Dr. Rebecca Flower. Beck is our Peer Research and Innovation Manager, and she keeps us all straight with lots of new techniques and also making sure that everything we do actually really does work and isn't just good to talk about. So you can either, after the session, talk to me, or if you want to find out what's really going on, talk to Beck. I'm the cheerleader. So, kia ora, New Zealand. There you are, a little bit of local inclusion. And it really is impressive when we come from Australia and see what you have already learned about inclusion here in New Zealand with your with various cultures, both in New Zealand and neighbours of New Zealand. And so I think what we're going to talk about today and what we're embarking on doing is going to be easy, because you get it, and I'm not sure that everyone else in the world gets that the same way, that is, gets inclusion and a diverse culture. So I have sort of retitled things just briefly, and so I've called it Removing the Divide, to give it some action, because I hope at the end of this we can have a focus on what it is that perhaps is standing in the way of successful harnessing of the magnificent talents of autistic people. And what we all need to do, whatever we are, whether we are one of those autistic talents, whether we are a business manager, whether we are a person in the community or a support giver, what we need to do and what we need to focus on to start to make a real difference. So that's my mission today. But I want to start perhaps in an unusual spot. But I think as this unfolds, hopefully you get the hang of where I'm going. And I'm starting with, in fact on the left, is the most recent book by Charles Schwab, who is the founder of the World Economic Forum. And he founded that in the late 70s, and he founded that in order to advance the way societies work, to put it in a nutshell. And that now is an iconic thing. And his book and the focus of the World Economic Forum at the moment is actually looking ahead at something that's coming at us like a steam train. And that is the fourth industrial revolution. Just for context, the first was about steam and stuff, and we made a few factories. And the second one came fairly quickly, and it was about electricity and mass production, and we started making cars and things. And the third one, which sort of started in the 50s and 60s, was the digital revolution, which many of us feel we're still just coming to grips with. But that one's done, and we're already on to the fourth. And the fourth is in fact this emerging world where all of these things are coming together, where the boundaries are blurring, where science is moving at such a fast rate, where we're hearing about drones, and we're hearing about technology and artificial intelligence and robots. And we're wondering what that's going to mean in society, but we better wonder pretty quickly, because it's going to mean it very soon. It is already making a difference in many countries. Many countries are worried about what their workers are going to do. Many workers are worried about what they're going to do in the future. Many companies are worried about whether they'll have a business in a few years' time. And so we have this rapidly coming steam train called the Fourth Industrial Revolution. Buried with it are some demographic changes that are happening in many of the world's biggest countries, and including New Zealand and Australia, and particularly China, where the ageing population means that there are less working brains that are going to be there to run the show when all of this breaks. So if we as humans are going to stay on top of it all, we better get on our bikes and get going. And to quote Robert Austin, who I will mention a little bit later on as well, a professor from Harvard University, who has done a lot to help the cause of Specialisterne and our message in the area of harnessing the outliers and harnessing the talent. Robert Austin says that the future is such that we cannot afford to waste one brain. The problems we face are so exquisite that we must have every brain and every person employed to do that. And juxtapositioning that with what the World Economic Forum is really worried about the fourth industrial age, is that it's appearing that we are starting to find a retraction of the haves, those who sort of run things at the moment, back into the shell. Sometimes it's ethnic. That means we don't like migrants coming into our country and we should just have it for ourselves. And other times it could be about people with perhaps disabilities who are looking a bit hard to involve in the workforce, so maybe we should push them out. So this is the message I want to explore and expand. Tell you a little bit about what Specialisterne is doing, and hopefully what you'll see also what we're going to do here in New Zealand. And we're wonderfully blessed by the support of Altogether Autism and Catherine and her team, who right from the start have got our message and are helping us make this all come to a reality. Yes.
The writer said that my daughter said that one of them I talked to you about, she said that what major problem in Auckland is a housing shortage. We're taking so many refugees in Auckland and not enough houses for them. They're building like mad, building a lot of them.
Yeah.
But the government hasn't really ratioed the houses to the immigrants that are coming in.
Yeah. And these problems, the question becomes, how do you solve it? Because it is a problem, and it's going to need to be solved with new ways of housing and new ways of people working together and new ways of people living. Now, I'll start now and be a bit optimistic. And these are front pages of some magazines. The most recent one that's up there is Harvard Business Review, May 2017, in fact May, June, so it's 1 month old. And the lead article in Harvard Business Review, or one of the lead articles, is called Neurodiversity as a Competitive Advantage. So what we're starting to see is a lot of discussion coming around and recognition that there is in fact something special that we as businesses and as societies have been overlooking. And there is no doubt that we at Specialisterne start from that perspective. We are trying to harness every brain and every soul and every person. And again, I'll come to more of that a little bit later on as to how you go after that. But the most recent on neurodiversity, other articles in the Sloan Business Review on harnessing the outliers, and that's an article written by Professor Robert Austin, and how he says that the only companies that will survive in 10 years' time will be those that know how to harness outliers. And what outliers are not the normal people that sit down the middle and have been all homogenised by HR practices. They are the oddballs. But he says the only companies that will survive will be those that harness the outliers. Not, it will be nice if some good companies can harness outliers. A very subtle but important difference. And previously, about a year ago, Harvard Business Review wrote a case for harnessing the outliers. A case for hiring outlier employees. A business case for it. Not a case that says we should do it, we should give it the door because it's a good charity, but a case that says we'll make better business because of it. But the reality and the grounding of where we are today in New Zealand, in Australia, in the UK, in the US, and worse still elsewhere, is that we are not doing that. We almost have not begun. In fact, the statistics show, country by country, that you are lucky if 20% of autistic people are employed to the extent of their capabilities. And there are surveys around the world that come back with that. So, we've been doing a little bit of work, and with the help of Altogether Autism, we've run 3 surveys in the past little while. I'll come back to the first of those surveys which is very positively and specifically about getting on the table some of the talent that can be employed today in businesses. The other two surveys went to employers and employees, autistic employees, asking their experience with autistic employment. We had about 50 people responded as employees, that was autistic people who had been employed. And this is summarising the major results of that. They talked mainly about two problems. They talked about the problem of getting a job. And they said it's hard to get a job because employers aren't really clear on what they want or don't really necessarily clearly know what they want. They said that it's difficult to do job interviews because we're not good at them and they don't suit us and they don't get to the heart of it. And they said that they don't really have an opportunity to demonstrate their skills. And then you can see why it's not working. And that's just being said around the world, by the way. We could do that survey in any country and we'll get exactly the same results. But they also said that when they try to keep a job, it's not so good either, because if they get through that miraculously at the front, keeping the job is not all beer and skills either, because they feel that they go into a workplace that is sort of lacking in awareness. They are in that sort of foreign jungle all of a sudden. And they got through the hurdle and jumped over the fence and got there and said, what the heck is this? Or more particularly, all the people who were there said, what the heck is that? No understanding about the problem or the need. And so coming with that comes the issue of poor support. Support that isn't quite right. Support that someone called today the support that's a Velcro support. You know, we'll put someone on your side and they can walk around with you everywhere. How's that going to give you a career? Needs to be some different way of doing it. All well-meaning, great disability support and well-meaning, usually pushed in the wrong direction by government funding and ill-conceived ideas about what's good and what's bad and what's needed. Again, let's come back to that toward the end to see if we can put together a plan for this. And they said all it takes is some people who believe in you, that recognise your talents. That's all I need. I actually aren't needing a whole lot more. I mean, support would be great and all of that, and I need that. But if you just, heart of hearts, respected me for what I am and saw what I could do and saw what my talent was and used it, we would be cooking on gas. That's as simple as it is. So we're starting to build an understanding amongst this group. Interestingly, in the employer side, we got a very small response. And I can't speculate why that was, but I think it's because it's very hard to find employers at the moment who are fully tuned into this issue, or who know who it is in the organisation who's tuned into it, so it just gets passed around until in the end no one responds. So we really didn't get meaningful results from employers because there were too few that came through. But great response from the talent. And I'll talk more about that with our other survey, where we've got about 140, 150 very talented people ready to put to work. Now that's positive. That's positive. And just taking it a bit further, and I will explain the picture there. I've introduced a couple of these, but in Australia we have been going for about 18 months, and we now have about 100 people in work. This was a group in Brisbane, and you actually can spot me in the middle of that one. This was in 2015 at the APAC conference, when this group had just been selected to be testers at the Department of Human Services in Brisbane. See there, what a great group that is. It's actually our founder on the left too, talking to Simon, who I should say a lot more about but haven't had a chance to yet, but he is inspirational in creating this direction globally. But this group, such a diverse group, so many different sorts of people, ranging through from older people like the person right down in front, who got this job in his 50s, having been 10 years out of work, previously in a train store, and is one of the best members of this testing team in Brisbane.
What do they actually do for testing?
They test application software to make sure it's working correctly. And they find errors in it and they tell the people who wrote it how to correct it. So they're testing software for computers. The comments underneath this that I just sort of put together because these are real people. People like this are the ones who answered our survey here. And these people who answered our survey, again, said real words, didn't just tick boxes in New Zealand about what they need. We need to make people more aware of what autism is. How simple is that? But that's a perception. We need to make people more aware of what it is. It isn't just Rain Man. It is many more things than that. We need to welcome autistic people into the workplace, and we need to recognise that we will be good employees, but may just need a bit more support in the beginning. Heartfelt sort of comment from someone who's saying, I've got a lot to offer, just give me a go here and help me out, and we will be good employees.
Are they contract or?
No, they work for DXC, Hewlett Packard Enterprise, have employed them, and they were our client.
But are they, what I mean is, are they time for years?
The initial project they're working on is 3 years in duration. They're about halfway through it at the moment.
That's a long time.
Yeah. So, Specialisterne and our idea, and this does come from our founder, Torkel Sonne. Torkel is a Danish person. In 2003, he and his wife found that their son, Lars, their third son, was on the spectrum. And to cut a long story short, they figured that everything was going to be okay until he grew up, and what the heck would he do then? So Torkel left his job and his career, mortgaged the house and founded Specialisterne in Denmark, initially to hire autistic people and train them how to be good workers, and that way provide a showcase that others would follow. That was the idea in 2003. By 2008, an article had been written in the New York Times about what he'd done, and he was getting requirements from all over the world of people who wanted to expand this, and so he formed the foundation. He sold his company into the foundation. The foundation's not for profit, and we took on the job of expanding this globally. And I'll talk a little bit later about what that sort of looks like today. But along the way, images are always good, and this is a simple one. So the dandelion, and you'll see a few dandelions around at the conference. Unfortunately, we've got to get a reprint of badges, or else you would have all gone out of here wearing one today. But the dandelion is our symbol, and the symbol comes from this story. The top left, a young child in a field of dandelions or in amongst dandelions. A great thing. They look good. When they go to seed, you can blow them, you can play games, you can make daisy chains. Everyone loves dandelions. Roll the child forward, however, to early 30s and a house and a garden. Out the first day to see the dandelion growing in the front garden, and that looks like a weed I'd better get rid of because it doesn't look right. It's not like the nice house next door. So that's a situation. What are we going to do? The dandelion, no good. But actually, wait a minute. The dandelion is one of our most valuable medicinal herbs. It is, in fact, and that is a field of dandelions being cultivated for harvesting to make teas, lotions, potions that are extremely medicinal and very good for you. And there are, in fact, in Denmark, many farms that actually make a full living out of creating these potions, and in fact it is available around the world. So in fact, put in the right environment and nurtured and understood, not for what it looks like as a weed, but for what it could contribute, the dandelion is one of the most valuable assets we have. And this is really at the heart of Specialisterne and what we hope to spread more broadly beyond ourselves into the community and this opportunity. This idea that all we have to do is recognise the value that is sitting there. We have to recognise that it may need some nurturing and some fertilising and some assistance. But once it's off and growing as a herb, it's going to contribute to our society. And you can see the analogy, I think, between the situation we believe we are currently sitting in and need to address. So our vision, the Specialisterne vision, it's a bit much sort of to call it a Specialisterne vision because there's only about 100 of us. Actually, I think there's 200 in total because we employ about 80 autistic people in Denmark in the original thing as our sort of showcase, and in Spain we do the same thing. We have about 60 people there. But on top of that, we're not thousands of people all around the world. But Torkel, when in 2008, he gave a presentation at Harvard Business School, because Specialisterne had become by then, thanks to Rob Austin, a case study. And it was a case study in social entrepreneurship. And he gave that to a group of chief information officers who run all the technology at companies and CEOs. And he had a standing ovation. As Torkel says, he felt pretty good with them all standing up, with little him making this presentation and them saying that's the best thing I've heard. And he marched out and saw the bookstore and he saw a book called What Unreasonable People Do. And he bought it because he said, I'm unreasonable, I better read this. And then it said you make unreasonable goals and you set unreasonable expectations. So he said, how about 1 million jobs in the world? How about we start with that? Million's understandable, it's memorable, and it's sort of a big impact. So he set us the challenge of actually getting 1 million opportunities. It's not actually very hard, because if 1% of the world population, for example, happened to be autistic, 1 million's sort of like a drop in the bucket. In fact, we could just do China and we'd do 1 million. They reckon there's 1 million job vacancies in cybersecurity in the world. So 1 million's not many. But sitting down here where Beck and I sit and sort of looking up, it still seems a bit. So we've got to 100 in Australia. But we've got a target in Australia of 12,000, and when we add New Zealand to it and get the whole thing cooking on gas, we'll make it 20. So we want 20,000 by 2025 as a target. That means something substantial, but still, frankly, only a drop in the bucket of the total opportunity that lays there. The chart I put there is our attempt to bring together then the business and the community and put a bit of a vision about where we're heading. On the axis up and down is the community. And we think communities, as we observe them in all the countries we operate in, South America, in Europe, in Asia now, and in Australia and New Zealand, start at apprehension as the place where the community feels. It really is the charitable way to say Pauline Hanson maybe isn't as bad as she seems. She's just misguided and apprehensive. So she's beaten out and saying, let's get it out of here. Let's get the weed out of the garden. But we want, and we see societies move from apprehension to appreciation. And if you remember those fronts of the magazines, they were appreciation. That's appreciation of the talent. That's what we want society to do, to appreciate it. And not just to appreciate it because it might be savant or technically sound, but I think in this room I was preaching to the choir, some of the nicest and most trustworthy and best people in the world are our autistic friends and colleagues and family. And so we need them for more than just their brain. We need them to make humanity balanced. In the workplace, we see a sort of a similar but slightly different transition. Starting with a workplace that says, well, I can help. And I call it segregation, but it's sort of put them over there in the corner, or have 2 or 3 working in that bit, because they won't matter over there. One workplace in Wellington said to me about 3 months ago when I came in, about to do a pitch a bit like this, so you might find this a bit funny, when they said, look, nice of you to come, but before you start, we don't have many jobs for people like that. We've sent most of those jobs to India. Well, I think I changed their mind at the end a bit when they felt a bit embarrassed if they thought back to what they'd said. But the fact is that it does start with a bit of put them in the corner, you know, we'd better not have it, might break something. I mean, it's risky. And where we're trying to go to is inclusion, where it is part of the workforce. I mean, we don't sort of look around and say how many people we got with blonde hair, you know, or the blonde ones will sit over there, or this is just a characteristic.
But I mean, telecom did the same. Now, of course, Spark the same. Got a lot of jobs. Chinese people answer the phone now.
Yeah.
It's a lot cheaper. They ask for profit, and they've gone very personal, not friendly at all.
That's right. And maybe it's not the right answer to do that. And also, it focuses. You know, there's all sorts of reasons why that may or may not be right. Not the least of which is potentially those jobs may not be the right ones for the autistic people, because we certainly aren't on about them doing those jobs.
There is also a point too about putting them in the corner and see what they do, because actually in John Robertson's book, Look Me in the Eye, have you read that book? There's an amazing story of him being over there in a secluded, separate place, actually really inventing some cool stuff.
Yeah, and I think, as he's always said, I think was said even at this conference, it is that everyone, you've met one autistic person, you've met one autistic person. And perhaps it's a good lead-in, Susan, to the right-hand side, which are the values. So we think that the answer to all of this, particularly in the workplace, is first of all respect. So it is respecting the talent as it is and for what it can do and what it needs. Secondly, clarity. Being sure that we ask the talent to clearly what's expected. Being also clear that as their co-workers or managers, we say what we think and we think what we say. And we are straightforward and honest. Something that we should do with any employee, frankly. But that's part of the formula. We should accommodate, and there are going to be people who need to be accommodated. We have the professor who works for us in Denmark, and the professor we found driving a taxi in Denmark. The professor, I would say, from what I have heard of him, is probably one of the most talented astrophysicists in Europe, if not the world. His autism is such that he has challenges managing teams and working in places. He thrives in our environment of 60 people. In fact, they say he's like the father figure. I think they call him the silver hair. He's terrific. And he solves exquisite problems for our clients. Amazing brain, what he can do when he turns his mind to it. He saved the wind farm energy group in Denmark $3 million a year by reviewing the wind farm performance logs for 2 months, the data for 2 months. I think he only looked at it for about a week, and found 15 faults in the way they'd set them up. He's just a brilliant person. He actually should be doing astrophysics, but he's in the right environment where he thrives, he's contributing and so on. So absolutely right. So accommodation is important to understand, a little bit of accommodation. And then finally, accessibility, giving them accessibility, giving the talent accessibility to the support they need, whatever that might be, small and large. Giving them accessibility to the sorts of help they might need to make sure they flourish. So, in a nutshell, that's us. 1 million jobs in the world. So get out of the road, we're coming. We're not after 3 jobs in the corner. I don't go to a CEO and you do this speech and he says, yeah, well, I reckon we can hire one on the switchboard. Sorry, another hour, close the door, I'm doing that again. You don't get it. How big's your workforce? 2,000 people. All right, you're up for 20 to start with, because that's 1%. And then we'll talk about it from there on. You know, that's the sort of way we need to go at this, because what's wrong with that? And worrying about it both at the company level and society level, understanding it's a big problem we're solving, not just a few companies that are a bit recalcitrant. So the opportunity is with the special talents. That great team there is from our Denmark office, and in 2015 they won the European Space Agency robotics competition. That's a pretty big deal. They had to build a robot that did something fascinating, got no idea what the heck it did. But they were the best robotics team in the whole of Europe. That's high performance. They happen to be, 5 of our 60, because they're not all like that. They're all got different talents. One's a musician. One's a fantastic musician who can play 2 pieces of music with left and right hand at one time, together, moulded into one piece. Jazz and classical. Whoa. What does that brain do when it processes facts in a different way and can take on board stuff? Terrific. Around the world, we operate in different ways. We try and reflect the way the community is. So in some places, we are operating where we hire the people because this is just starting and it's brand new and we want to provide a role model. And companies are really averse, so they like to just sample. So they like to just pop in and have someone for 3 months and bring them back. And because that's so bad the way it's done at the moment, where they're put there on contract and then sent back to their employment worker, we employ them ourselves and they work for Specialisterne. In other parts, we provide education and training because things are working pretty well. And in other parts of the world, we actually run programs like we're looking at running here and like we run in Australia, where we help initially large companies and then progressively smaller ones hire substantial numbers of autistic people. Across the bottom are the successes in Australia so far. The Department of Health and Human Services are working at the moment. Their jobs in digitisation of data, fascinating, going back in records that are up to 200 years old, and the handwritten records that need to be digitised and brought into the 21st century. And we're a mining engineering company. We have a cadre of cadet engineers there who are going to be the start of their new innovative workforce, designing new pumps and things and solving problems in mining engineering. At Suntalk, we have 20 people looking after pigs on pig farms in Brisbane and in Adelaide. And they're doing some fantastic work and again transforming a workforce of 700 farm workers. And they need more and more of those people. And SAP as a global client, as is DXC. DXC have run programs in Australia in a particular model that they run for Department of Human Services, for the Department of Borders and Immigration, and for Defence. All of those clients now want to put the program on steroids and want to hire more people because they've been so pleased with how it's gone. Around the world, you'll see lots of interesting things. There's 3 there. Rising Tide Car Wash is interesting. If you've heard of that, out of Florida, a gentleman with an autistic child decided to, the car wash would be the thing, and is now franchising around the US. Very iconic. Under some questions because they're all autistic people who work together, and some people say that's not perfect, it's not inclusive, but who are we to judge? He's doing a great job and they're very happy people. Auticon coming out of Germany, they're planning to hire 5,000 consultants and to be a mix but largely autistic people doing business consulting and IT consulting across Europe. Richard Branson has just bought into that company, so that's got plenty of capital. And I put Walgreens up there because they've done some magnificent things with disability in general, but very high proportion of disabled people, including a high proportion of autistic people in some of their warehouse operations with fantastic documented results. So there's lots of different models for how this can go, and I put that up there to say, inspire you, come and hit me, tell me what we can do. If you've got an idea about how this is going to work, everything's good. We don't want Specialisterne to be big. We want to inspire things to happen. We want to set the lead, we want to set the benchmark, make sure it all works together. But we want all you to pick this up and run with this, because there are opportunities everywhere to do lots of interesting things. And as I said, we're really lucky to have the support we do from Altogether Autism. We do have a way, and Beck helps with her colleagues around the world to document our way. We have a lot of challenges that we have to deal with, so we can base it on what are the challenges going to be. We assess people very patiently. We take about 4 weeks to assess people for their job and to work out where they're going to fit in. We take the time to onboard them and give them support, and if you remember back to our principles, our values, we try and live the values through our process. But what I say to a company is, don't worry, we know how to do this. This comes with a fixed price to deliver. Companies pay for this service. So they're employing people, they should pay for it. They pay for that, and we bill them on milestones. So they know that, and that's normal business. It's not a charitable enterprise. So removing the divide, which is where I started this, is about a few things. It is actually recognising that there is a supply and demand issue here. I haven't dealt with supply, but that's a big question. We think there needs to be a circle of support in the education that feeds into this demand. We're dealing with the demand end and setting up ways to create the demand, to provide the support and make it all come together. Our first summary statement is, of course, this is not about the autistic people. It's not the autistic people who need to change, but it's the way the labour market works. So that's where we start imagining this. This is not about coming and saying, you'd better change yourself and be better at doing interviews. No, that's not what it's about. Our enemies are three things, if I summarise it. They are apprehension at the start. And it manifests itself in, I couldn't do that, I don't do that, I don't have any jobs, I send all those jobs to India. Whatever can be put in the road to get you out of the way, because they're apprehensive. How could Rain Man ever work in my business? Or perhaps, how could that child down the street who I've seen struggling with a meltdown, what would happen if we translated that into workplace? Boy, that'd be terrible, wouldn't it? Apprehension, you have to overcome that. The second enemy we have, unfortunately, is the drive for efficiency through standardisation. HR practices that try and get recruiting done quickly. We have examples around the world of programs we've run taking 4 weeks. HR picks it up and says, we loved it, but it takes too long, so we're going to do it in 3 days. Guess what happens? We have 3 years of employment success, and they have 3 months. And then they come back and say, you know, it didn't work. Guess what? It didn't work because it failed the fundamental principles. And by the way, our program of 4 weeks isn't much if you're thinking about an employee who's going to be with you for 5 or 10 years. So you spend 4 weeks figuring them out. What the heck? That's cheap. Especially if they're going to be some of your best employees. And then we need to move society's feeling and companies' feelings to the fact that this is an imperative, not an option. So this is not optional. When I walk out of the CEO's office, I'm not leaving him with a, do you want to do this? I have to leave him with, I have to. And just very quickly, because I'm conscious of time, again, circling back to the 4th industrial age, we've created this diagram to actually try and continue to move the thinking about what this is all about and the opportunity that's here. Remember I mentioned that we have these levels of talent, the cream of through the heart. We're putting to companies that if they want their company to succeed in the 4th industrial age, they have to have a workforce which harnesses not just the cream, but harnesses right through to the heart. And they have to have a workforce that knows how to do that, not just for small teams and small groups, but for the enterprise as a whole. And to do that, what better way to learn and to hone your skills than using the autistic segment as the ones, because all of the talents and the techniques we're going to learn in that will be applicable across the whole workforce. It's ready and it's there and it's ready to use. We should have a situation where people people in companies strive to manage autistic people, because that's the way they're going to prove they're a real manager. We want to pull, not to push. And we think, I'm happy to talk about that some more, but that's a life-changing idea, and that's the imperative, not the option.
Where is the training done?
Usually in the workplace, in the work area.
The 4 weeks is done in the work area.
Yeah. So, just wrapping up, I'm getting the wind up here because time's up, but we have the survey that's still open for another couple of days. So if any of you know talent, fill in the survey. Let us all work out whether that talent's right or not. You've heard what we're saying. Believe us, we're not looking for PhDs, although in the survey so far, we have some PhDs. We have a number of people with degrees in IT and other things. And we have many very talented people who have taught themselves and have great stories to tell. And if you see the survey, I hope you'll find this is not asking for a resume, this is asking me to tell about yourself and who you are. So do apply. Oh yes. Well, it'll be today by the end of the week. It should have been the 21st, shouldn't it? Well, you might find it's still open, but get onto it if you haven't seen about it. We'll leave it up for a little while. We do have to close off, you're quite right, but we do have an opportunity next week with an employer who told us 3 months ago, come back with the idea of what talent's available and I'll give you some jobs. So I've got 150 so far who want jobs.
And how many do you need?
Well, 150 would be great. I was hoping they might take 30 or 40 in the first bid, but we'll see.
So we don't project it today.
Yeah. It'll be open. Let's agree right now. It will be open until the end of the weekend, until Sunday.
Until Sunday if she applies.
To fill it in. Yep. Good. And last slide, wrapping up. And we do wrap back, trying to wrap the story back. But it's been mentioned a couple of times, Steve Silver's book. That's the story I've been telling. He writes eloquently about that story, about neurotribes. A great book, some great ideas. He says we live in exciting times. He recognises the challenge of the fourth industrial age. And he basically says we can't afford to waste one brain, one talent, one person going forward. And as a last message, we did get endorsement 2 years ago at the United Nations on World Autism Day, where the United Nations and Ban Ki-moon announced this, adopted our challenge of 1 million jobs. And to the group called the Global Compact, which are the largest companies around the world who support the UN and their ideals, they have the challenge of supporting us to get 1 million jobs by 2025. And you can see his announcement from that. So this is not just a local thing, and if you have businesses yourselves or you know people, they are joining a movement that's going to be enormous. They can be confident and they can be bold, and we will support them with the help of Altogether Autism.
Well, point on that, the survey is not the last chance to get on the Specialisterne Waka. We are partnering with Specialisterne in the future, so please don't think you've got to have it sorted by the 20th of the end of the weekend. We are talking next week with other businesses and organisations, so this is just the start. There really is no closing date. This has just been the first process.
Survey is one employment round. First employment round, our vision is to bring the organisation into zero.
Yeah.
So, yes, by all means, get it on the survey. That's not only primary doing this in New Zealand.
Okay.
Well, we're not really running late because we started late, but I'd like to thank you both for that mind-blowing. I'm now feeling about 80 years old because you're talking about industrial revolution, so I'm like, oh my God. So thank you so much for that information. And I do know that on our Autism website, that is all that information's there. So if you're still looking for it, you go to our website, you will find it, and you will be able to get the link to do that as well.
Yes. And Beck and I will be out on the stand for the next little while, so come and chat, because actually the issues I think we raise in many cases will be personal, not general, and very happy to work with you on how we can